Good evening, everybody. I'm Reverend Richard Nordgren, Associate Member of St. John's Lutheran Church, which is sponsoring this Bible study, which we call The Many Faces of God. Since earlier this year, we began at the very opening book of the Old Testament, Genesis, and have devoted our study to the different ways that God has come across to his chosen people and by extension to the rest of the world. We have seen God portrayed as the creator magnificent, but also the destroyer. We've seen God as a warrior and commander-in-chief of the armed forces of a nation. We've seen him as the intimate friend of a family who offers wise advice. So far, we've seen many different portrayals of God, and tonight, we'll be looking at yet another way that God defines his presence in the lives of people. But first, before we get into the new stuff, let's spend a few minutes reviewing what we've covered to date. Beginning with the very first humans, God has entered into agreements, contracts, if you will, which are called covenants. And there has been a covenant with Adam and Eve, covenant with Noah, a covenant with Abraham, with Moses and the Israelites at Sinai. In each of these cases, the covenant served to define the mutual expectations of God and in Israel. It is worth noting that the covenants are between the nation of Israel, not specifically with individuals, although, as we shall see, the kings of Israel were expected to be the exemplars, actually function as viceroys rather than as independent sovereigns, and enforce or hold people accountable for the requirements of the covenants that God had offered and which had been accepted by Israel. And, there was a long period of time when the tribes of Israel, after they had invaded and mostly conquered the Canaanite and expelled or deported, if you will, the native inhabitants. This process of claiming and of ethnic genocide was not complete. And so Israel was faced from time to time with neighbors, which had not been totally defeated and who had long memories. Mm-hmm. They're far better at relishing what had happened to them and basking in the warmth of those revenge-filled feelings than they were of thinking about, how can we make a better world, at least in our little part of that world, in which now Israel is a reality. Even though it took this land by force and that was done unjustly, we still have to live together. That sort of thinking really didn't enter into the conversation. It was mainly thoughts of how they would acquire or reacquire the land that had been taken from them, how to humiliate the Israelites, and in the process, stuffing their noses in the dirt and bringing great shame upon them. To meet with these threats, God would call up charismatic leaders, who were adept military figures, but they were only in place for the time of need. Once the threat of invasion was past, the judges, as they were called, were they pretty much went back to doing what people do, growing their crops, raising their families, looking after their herds, thinking about the weather, maybe even contemplating a vacation trip to Miami. Who knows? People will be people. But this system of ad hoc, spur of the moment leadership, was one that had its detrimental side as well. There is no continuity of leadership. There is no one who was going to ensure that there was an army in place, that it was well trained, that it was provisioned, that it had the weapons that it needed to accomplish its mission. There was no one who could enforce the requirements of the state by collecting taxes or getting after tax evaders. No, it was a libertarian's dream come true. But as I say, the downside of it is that, many times Israel was caught off guard, when its enemies rose up in war against them. And there had been some initial clamor, in the time of the judges to have a king, but that didn't get any traction. God certainly wasn't in favor of it. And the one claimant to a new position, he came to a poor end. And so with him, the idea died. But it gained traction several generations later, as I said, largely because the Philistines, were a significant military threat. The people are saying to each other, and probably to God too, is that the reason the Philistines are doing so well is that they've got a king, they've got a commander in chief, they've got someone who can levy taxes and make sure that they're paid. He can conscript soldiers and train them and send them off to battle. We can't do that without a king, so we need one too. God still wasn't pleased with the idea of having a king a second time around. He is known to mutter under his breath on one occasion, aren't I enough king for all of Israel? And it was a raw rhetorical question, which betrayed his disappointment. I'm quite sure that that's the story that he would tell of if he was asked the question. Okay? So that with the clamor for a king and God, somewhat reluctantly, I'd say, I don't want to go too much stronger than that, but reluctantly going along with the thing. The leaders of the people, nominated Saul to be their king, and Saul was a pretty good choice from the quick read of his CV. He was well spoken. He had a commanding presence. He looked like he was a king. He acted like he was a king. He spoke like he was a king. And so Saul was the first king, but it was not necessarily the best choice in the long run, as we shall see. And it was his arch rival, David, who came to center stage, as God, disfavored Saul, God favored David. It was very obvious, in spite of all the hijinks that David had committed, in spite of all the wars against his own people as a mercenary for the Philistines that he committed, he still had, God's backing. So when Saul died by his own hand, in battle with the Philistines, David was well positioned to take over. And in the beginning, his successes just piled on one another. He was a very good administrator. He was a very good military leader. He's a very good statesman. Perhaps his strongest suit was that he was a very good politician. And he's one of these people that you want to keep your back to the wall when he comes into the room. And you don't take him necessarily at his word. Okay? But even the people who were somewhat suspicious of him, had to admit that he put on a very good initial appearance. He really did come across as the right guy for the right moment for the right people. The authors of the books of the Kings, were probably individuals who were part of the royal court at one time or another. They had heard the stories. Centuries later, after David, when Israel was down on its luck, it had been conquered, Jerusalem had been ravaged, temple destroyed, the elites deported, that they sat down and codified the stories and put them down in a coherent form. But even though they were, the officials of the court, they left enough evidence that you can look and see that David was not necessarily a neat, sweet little boy, who was out there tending the sheep and writing these beautiful psalms. He was a fearless, person who was not scared of even something like Goliath. Young teenagers, tend to be sort of big on themselves, but it's quite a stretch to imagine someone as young as David, not old enough to be part of the family contingent of the army, taking on such a powerful opponent as Goliath. So David had wanted to build a temple, but God says, nope, I'm not ready for you to do that. That's going to be your son's job. But as a consolation prize, I am going to make a commitment to you. And that commitment is that someone from your house, someone from your lineage, someone who bears your DNA will be on the throne of Israel forever and ever. And there was some implication that the firstborn had the first claim to the throne. As we'll see in practice, that didn't work out too well. But as First Kings opens, we find that David is about to pass from this mortal plane, enter into his rest, and his misdeeds and follies of his later life were catching up with him. One of his sons, Adonijah, got it into his head that he ought to be king since he was the eldest of David's sons. He got backing from the military commander, from the priests, from the court elites, at least some of them, and brazenly stepped out in public and says, "I'm your new king." And the army supports me, the priests support me, the royal advisors support me. Acknowledge me as your king. Well, David was far from being dead at that point. He still had some vigor in him. Not a whole lot, but enough. And he was easily swayed by Bathsheba, who came to lobby him on behalf of their son Solomon. And David gave into her entreaties and said that Solomon would be his successor. So in the first book of Kings, what we find is the struggle for succession was pitting members of the family against each other in a power struggle to see who was going to be the next king. And I would like to read a passage from First Kings to give you a sense of what that was like. First Kings, first chapter, beginning with the first verse. King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. So his servants said to him, "Let a young virgin be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be his attendant. Let her lie in your bosom, so that my lord the king may be warm." So they searched for a beautiful girl throughout all the territories of Israel and found Abishag, the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The girl was very beautiful. She became the king's attendant and served him, but he did not know her sexually. There it goes on to talk about the plot of Adonijah, to succeed, David. We, as I mentioned, that was a failure. And now in the fourth chapter of Kings, we see that Solomon is in position. And Pastor, would you read 1 Kings 4, 20 through 28.
Yes. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Oops. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates to the to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, all of them under the vines and fig trees. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those officials supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. They also brought to the required place barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. So he lived big.
Okay. He did. He did it in superlatives. No, that's a lot of taxation that is going into that. Yeah. But Solomon benefited from his father's foreign policy, and so the neighbors of Israel, were not much of a threat in the beginning years of his reign. Apparently, he had established an effective administrative system so that taxes could be collected. I don't know what the exchange rate would be, but for was it 40 cores of flour or 30 cores of flour, choice flour? That would probably be enough to account for the annual income for a family of at least 3 or 4. Okay? Then all the rest. There's the 10 oxen, the 60. What is it? 10 oxen. 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, deer, gazelle, roebuck, and fatted fowl. That's a lot of protein. Protein was an expensive food commodity in those days. So when you read about that abundance, then you allow for some inflation. But even so, that's a lot of tax money. It takes a lot of tax money to get that paid off. Okay. Solomon, was aware of the agreement that God had offered David about the succession and the building of the temple, and with abundant revenue and opportunity, to take care of internal matters. Solomon set about the building of the temple. Let's see, get my notes here. It's interesting to note, if you read closely into 1 Kings, that God was not consulted about his choice of domain. He wasn't asked anything about the material, the decor, the layout. No, nothing. That was Solomon and his people's decision. It was offered to God. At its dedication. And God did show up, and took residence, at least for a while, in the temple. Scared the bejesus out of everybody who was close enough to see it. But here's something very interesting. During the dedication of a temple, one would think that the religious leaders of the people would be in charge of the ceremony. Didn't happen that way. David was in charge of the ceremony. Solomon was in charge of, Another thing which is really interesting, when it came time, for blessings, as I said, it wasn't the priest. And it wasn't that people asked God to bless Israel or to bless the temple. It was Solomon who blessed the people and who blessed the temple. That's sort of like Napoleon, crowning himself in 1805, taking the crown of the French Empire from the Pope's hand and putting it on his own head. It's that momentous. It really is. And so the temple gets built, and Solomon still has not satisfied his cravings, to build things. So he builds a house for himself. This too is done in the grandest of form, with expensive furnishings and material. Nothing too good for our king. And David and Solomon saw to it that nothing was going to be too good for him. Let's see. Okay. I will read from 2 Kings in the chapter 8, 1 through 13. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. All the people of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the festival in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests carried the ark. They brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant up to the Lord, to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, as the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim made a covering over above the ark and its poles. The poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place in the front of this inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside. They were there to this day. There is nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses had placed there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister before that cloud. The glory of the Lord filled the house of David. And Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in the thick darkness. I have built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. Yeah. Wow, pretty good stuff. He probably was his own best PR person. He doesn't go too far, astray from making everything look super great. And it was. It probably was. Okay. In chapter 9, God appears to Solomon a second time. First time he appeared to him, he had assured Solomon that he was going to have his backing, provided that Solomon kept to the Lord's ways. Solomon agreed to that. And the second time that God came to Solomon, it was once again the same story. The commitment to the house of David, provided, of course, that Solomon and his successors remained loyal to God and that they were well behaved. Even though Solomon had a huge treasury, and abundant cash flow. Building everything to the highest degree is very expensive. Yeah, he put a lot of stuff on the credit card. And his creditors were asking for payment. For example, the king of Tyre, said, "You owe me a lot of money for all that cedar that I sent you." David said, "Well, I don't have the cash on hand, but I'll give you 20 cities up in Galilee. You can have them." What do you think about that? Well, what I think about it is that Solomon was pawning off Israel's gift, its inheritance, to satisfy his personal ambition. And another thing that David did, which was a way of making him the center of this project, and not allowing the ordinary Israelites to have a part in the construction and fixing of is their own major religious site. Native-born Israelites didn't work at building up the temple. It was conscripted Canaanites that did that. They were the ones were forced labor that they did the work on the major projects such as the temple, Solomon's house, and the building and rebuilding of cities throughout the land. So years later, when the Queen of Sheba came on a royal visit, the editors of the Book of Kings bragged about his wealth. Solomon is probably best remembered by ordinary members of our churches as the wise king. That was his one request. And in the beginning, that was a gift that God bestowed upon him, and which he used wisely and probably regularly. But into his reign, his head became full of himself, we'll put it that way, and thought that he could very well do without anybody's advice but his own. As a result of that, he did what kings normally do, to secure their thrones. He entered into alliances, and these alliances were cemented by marriages. So Solomon acquired one wife from Egypt, an Egyptian princess, became part of his household. There was another, princess, who came from Ammon, and she brought, her ways with her. There's others, who brought their people's gods with them. Perhaps, we can overlook Solomon's proclivity to have a lot of sexual partners. Maybe we can justify it by saying, well, he did so many good things. Why are we going to hold him to account for this, apparent transgression of the commandments regarding adultery? But what really, stuck in the craw, was not his reckless disregard of sexual morality and, popular opinion regarding that commandment. His offenses were that his number of his wives were non-Israelites. No way is an Egyptian princess going to be able to fob herself off as a native-born Israelite. No princess from Moab is going to be able to pass, as an Israelite woman. Everybody knew where these people came from, and that they had brought their own deities with them. God had expressly forbidden external marriages. Exogamy, I believe it's called, was forbidden. And Solomon was going about it left and right. like he had never heard of that restriction. God had prohibited, but Solomon seemed he could get away with it. And I don't know whether he was seduced into worshiping the gods of his wives, but he did. He joined them in the worship of Astarte, of Milcom, of Chemosh, and others. And this is all the things that anybody could do to God. That betrayal in a relationship, that's the one that hurts the most. And God was really, really, upset with Solomon. And for his transgressions, according to the covenant, Solomon was, supposed to die by capital punishment. But God had made this promise to David, that he would chasten, the misdeeds of his successors, but he wouldn't wipe them out. So even though the law had expressly committed God to this capital punishment regime, for marrying outside the nation, for worshiping false gods, idols, God fell back on what we were talking about last week as figurative punishment. The literal interpretation of the law required the death of Solomon. But God said, man, I can't do that. I've got myself painted into a corner. What am I going to do? Well, as Solomon was getting along in years, the matter of his successor became the stuff of court gossip. Who was going to support who? Who was going to be on whose side? Who was the front runner? Probably changed every 30 minutes. But when you don't have much to do, and there's a lot of people with whom you can gossip and speculate, that's what was going on. There were some, who were slowly rising to the top of consideration. Rehoboam, I call him Robbie, and Jeroboam, Jerry. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. Jerry, was a soldier. But he was a leader who had God's favor. And God said to Jerry, okay, my mouth is full of disgust for the things that Solomon has done. Yet I have a commitment, to his father that I have to honor. So while I should go about, making sure that he does not live any longer, I'm not going to do that. But what I'm going to do, is take the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and that will be your kingdom to rule. Okay? In honor of my commitment to David, Robbie, you will get the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And so with the passing of Solomon, there was a division of the kingdom. The northern 10 tribes kept the name Israel. The southern 2 tribes took the name of Judah, from which the word Jew is derived. You would think that there would be efforts, or at least conspiracies, to find 2 ways, or at least to bring the 2 split kingdoms back into a union. That never really happened, in the generations after the breakup of Israel. The northern tribes had their independence. The southern 2 tribes had its independence. From time to time, they would collaborate, in dealing with a common problem. But by and large, they treated each other, with some disdain, and definitely at arm's length. Jerry got into hot water, pretty quickly. he saw, probably as an astute political conclusion, that if the people in his 10 tribes continued to worship Yahweh, the God of Jerusalem, people would not regard, him or his territory as an independent, respected, nation state. So he said, we have to pick some other God that we're going to worship. Well, that got him smack dab in the idolatry, pit, which he was never able to get out of. He didn't do very well. He had the successors of both Robbie and Jerry turned out to be, by and large, a bunch of incompetent, foolish individuals who did not know, who they owed their loyalty to. Kings being kings, they said, we'll do what kings ought to do. We will rule, we will govern. We will not be God viceroy, on the land, but we will be our own rulers. Perhaps the worst of the lot on either side was King Ahab up north. We'll take a little look at him because he commands a lot of attention in the book of Kings. Pastor, would you read from chapter 19, 11 through 18?
(11 through 18). He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of the Abdel Melo, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, this is a rich passage. I really like it. Elijah had accepted God's commission, to be a prophet speaking truth to power. He'd done that with, great aplomb. But Ahab, which is probably predictable, did not repent of his ways. Instead, he took offense at what Elijah was telling him. Bolstered and supported by the lobbying of his foreign-born wife, Jezebel, Elijah was forced to flee. He went off into the wilderness, hoping to escape the wrath of Ahab and Jezebel. And by the time he got to this cave where he took refuge, he was a dispirited, disappointed, self-described failure. And that's when God came to him. Of the many ways that God has presented himself, to human beings, he has come across as the Lord God Almighty on numerous occasions. And that's what we hear, or what we are looking for, in the wind, in the rumbling, in the stark power of nature, being exhibited. We expect the Lord God Almighty to step out of the cloud, and say, "Come here, Elijah. Your work's not done." But rather, what we find is that God came to Elijah as a peaceable father. The promise that God had made to David that he would treat, his successors as a father would treat sons. Now we see God acting as father to Elijah, not boosting up his adrenaline, Lord God Almighty, but as the compassionate, loving, kind, and understanding father that Elijah needed at that point. So with some nourishment, with a pep talk, a pat on the back, promises of support, Elijah grabbed up his gear and headed back. It took a long time, for him to succeed in his mission. But eventually, the dogs licked the blood of Ahab, and his wife Jezebel died in shame. And there was a very peaceful and elegant passing of authority when Elijah died. God had appointed a successor, someone who would be like a son to Elisha. The the resume of Elijah is very impressive. The resume of Elisha is probably even more impressive. His kindnesses that he showed to the outcast, the least, and the lost, those who don't have a say or standing in society, were the sort of people that attracted Elisha's attention. The widow and her son, who had barely enough flour and enough meal and oil for a small loaf of bread, were filled day after day. It reminds me of the many decent and wonderful and compassionate things that Jesus did in dealing with the least and lost in his time in society. I think we have a taste of what's to come in the stories of Elijah and Elisha, where they were not great military leaders. They didn't have an army to support them. They couldn't even call on God to bring down the angels of destruction. But they were true speakers, true seekers, compassionate men, inspirational men, and people who probably, other than Moses, most of us know about from the Old Testament. Elijah has become a very popular figure because of his kindness and compassion. And the same is true as Elisha, even though he's not so well known. The story next week continues in 2 Kings. It's not a whole lot better in terms of the type of leaders that Israel and Judah got. Perhaps they got the type of leaders that they needed or deserved. That was their punishment. Who knows? The text is silent on that speculation, but the absence of evidence is not necessarily the same as the lack of evidence. It's just that we not have found it yet. So with that, any last words or questions that you would like to offer?
Politicians have largely been the same forever.
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard, to find an effective politician who's also been a person of deep personal faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's even harder to find an effective politician, who has a sense of justice faith.
Mm-hmm.
That, that's even harder to find out. I don't think I know of any examples of that.
Well, I mean, I remember when
Abraham Lincoln might come close.
I remember when Bernie Williams was running for the first time against Hillary, basically for the Democratic nomination. And it struck me that he was the most Christian candidate, and he was a secular Jew. But yeah, I think, I mean, I would say that our president and the Obama administration really spoke, and Pete Buttigieg. I mean, Pete Buttigieg is a devout Christian. And the rhetoric that they use is very different. I think that in the Obama administration, it was insufficient to stop the true evils that he perpetuated through the unmanned drone bombing that they did. The amount of deportations that was done under the Obama administration, George Bush II could have only dreamt of that many deportations. That, there was not a seamlessness of faith that affected policy. But, I think to have that would be I've never seen that. Where, I just have not seen that. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, but there is, to be a leader like that, you have to have some kind of lust for power or some kind of narcissism that allows you to be sufficiently ruthless to be in those, the absolute top echelons. I think it's the same for bishops in some ways. And, for high up executives in these multinational, ginormous corporations, that there's some place that we just don't allow our faith to seep into, and we conveniently just close it out. And I think that what scripture shows is the reality of the human condition has been with us for a very long time, and that technology has changed. Yeah, technology has changed us. Advancements in medicine and discovery have changed us, but the true nature of humans has not changed all that much.
Yeah. So that's why it is possible with the use of imagination to enter into the world of the biblical character.
Right.
Yeah. That's one of the benefits that I see of the stability of human nature is that it gives us a portal back into history.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, shall we have a prayer and then go about our other nightly duties?
Yes, please.
Gracious and holy God, you've loved us so much, so dearly, so in such a costly way too. Your generosity and grace is just awe-inspiring. It's wonderful to know that you're willing to take great risks with your riches. Not that it's going to make you look good, but it's going to make us look good. And at times we want to hide from that spotlight. At times we don't want the responsibility that comes with it. At times at times we just wish you'd leave us alone. But as you promised, you would be like a father to us, loving us, guiding us, supporting us, correcting us, allowing circumstances to humble and teach us. So on this day when we honor parents, we thank you for being a very, very good parent to us. May our memories of how you have been with us and enlarged and deepened and expanded our faith. May we never get caught up in the lies about you, or the untruths about you. May your Spirit come and shine a bright light of truth as we learn more about your many faces. We ask you to receive our blessing of you in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. You're muted.
Thank you, Pastor Nordgren.
You're welcome.